Okay, so as I said, I think Socrates has a pretty good response to Thrasymachus, but, what can we learn from him? What can we learn from this dialogue generally? One of the things I want you to learn from the dialogue, generally, one of the big things, is just, how philosophy's done, what it looks like. And as I said, it does look like what you see Socrates doing here, asking for an account of something. In our case, we're going to ask for an account of what morality is. We're going to try to get good moral theories, but also testing it by trying to think of possible counterexamples, ways that this account might give a really silly or obviously false answer, right? But I think, we can learn from Thrasymachus himself more specifically, or the challenge we see this character offering here. Now, one thing I think we should learn just in the response that Socrates offers is that it's wrong to think of justice or morality as being zero sum. And I think we see this sometimes in our own politics, right? This idea that for one group to do better, another group has to do worse. That it's just the pie is a limited size and it's just how we slice it up. I don't think that's true. And I actually think there's a lot of evidence that good laws, good policies can make things bigger, can make things better for everybody. And so sometimes, a just policy, a good policy will help everyone out. So I'll give you guys an example, and I'll just, I might be wrong about this, but I tend to think that community college at least should be tuition free. And I would say, we'll know, if you read some of the, you know, newspapers, especially like if you pick up the Washington Post, they seem to hate this idea. The Post is always like, oh, number, free college tuition, blah, 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 whatever. It's terrible. Handouts, right? Post is always on this line. There's nothing the Washington Post seems to be more outraged about than the idea that people might get free college tuition. And they'll always say, let's look at, well, why should everyone else have to pay for this thing that'll only benefit some students? And, I would say to the Post, or if I were there, it's like, well, look, when people can get a college education, it doesn't just benefit them, they tend to contribute more to society. There's all these economic studies, the GI Bill that made college more affordable for veterans. You know, I forget the exact amount, but basically there was a huge return on investment because what people could do with more training and more education, right? Society as a whole benefited from this. And, not surprised, the woman who writes all the economic stuff for the Post, I think, has a degree in English and has not actually studied any economics, which does not stop her from lecturing everyone about it. But it's like if this woman, Catherine Rampell, actually had, she'd see, like, well, look, you make education more available. You are not just making one group pay to benefit another one, or at least I would say this, you're probably benefiting society as a whole. I might be wrong about that, and we'll come back to reasons I might be wrong about that, but that's my perspective. I think it's a good policy, not because I think we should soak the wealthy suburbanites in Alexandria or I don't know what the rich suburbs in Maryland are, but whatever these places, right? Not because I think we should, soak these rich suburbanites to help people who aren't as well off. It's because I think this would be a thing that actually makes us all better off. We might have to pay a little bit in the short term. We will do better in the long term. Now, again, I might be wrong about that. I am not an economist. I will freely admit that. Again, people who write economics posts for the Washington Post aren't either, but whatever. Anyway, I think this is a policy that could benefit everybody. We'll come back to this. We'll talk more about this when we get the unit on justice. But I think there's something to be learned from Thrasymachus too. Now, look, Thrasymachus definitely overstates his case. He says this is what justice always is, or what morality always is. This is what it really is in every single case if you see through it. I think he's wrong about that. I think that Socrates is right, and that at least in some cases, or at least part of justice, ideally can be systems that benefit everyone. But I think there's an element of truth to this. You know, there are definitely times where we see people in charge using moral language to manipulate other people. Divine right of kings, right? But I think it's a little more complicated than Thrasymachus lets on. I think sometimes we do see people consciously trying to con others by using moral language simply to control them. I think that does happen. I think Thrasymachus is completely right about that. And I think that's one reason to be skeptical about moral claims. But I think sometimes it's more complicated, right? I think a lot of times we might make a moral system that benefits us or take moral claims that benefit us, and we might do it without trying to con other people. We might convince ourselves that it's really in the best interests of all, even though it especially helps us, right? And look, I picked the example of free community college tuition because it might be one near and dear to your hearts. It would make your life easier, but it'd also be good for me, right? More students, my job is more secure, my pay might go up, right? Now, that's not the reason I think this is a good policy. I'm not just like, yeah, free community college, give me some money, right? But the fact it would benefit me and benefit my students, is that a reason that I'm more sympathetic to it? That's very possible, right? I might be seeing things in a way, I might be endorsing a certain policy, a certain idea of what justice is and requires, because it's good for me, and I would like to talk myself into thinking that's what's good for me or good for my students is good for everyone, right? I think that is even more common than a group of people getting together and coming up with moral claims just as a way to fool others, right? That we might endorse certain moral claims because they are good for us, even without enough criticism, and I think we should worry about that. So I think generally, not a skepticism about morality, not that you should go out and be a horrible person, like Thrasymachus seems to recommend, but I think you should be skeptical about individual moral claims, because there really is a tendency for people to either use morality as a system to control others, to fool them, that does happen, but even more commonly to make morals, to sort of tailor it to suit ourselves in ways that help ourselves. Be aware, be skeptical, make sure that that's not going on. Now, I put a lot of emphasis on this because even next week, when we get to utilitarianism, when we start talking about so-called effective altruism, you might guess that I'm not crazy about effective altruism. There are scare quotes in my mind around both effective and altruism there. I think that this is true of effective altruism. I think it is a moral system as it's developed that benefits a certain class of people. But I'm not sure that these people set out to fool us. I think that they just might make their moral system in a way that is good for them. We will talk about that next time, next week when we talk about utilitarianism, and I will bring a lot of this sort of Thrasymachus style skepticism into play. More moderate than him, but I do think we should be skeptical about individual moral claims, because this thing that he thinks is always going on, I don't think it's always moral theories. Morality does this, but it sometimes does, and we need to keep a watch for it. All right. So next week, we will start talking about moral theories proper and how to work out a good moral theory. The first moral theory we will take a look at is utilitarianism.